Stop his enemies with their dragon power. Drag teeth, dragon tail, burning dragon fire. A real live wire. American dragon, dragon up. American dragon. Hey there. Hi. Hello. Sorry, I was just thinking about how strange it was that I just noticed that growing up, a lot of media I ingested and loved had very Asian-related aesthetics. Things like Code Lyoko, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Samurai Jack, Jackie Chan Adventures, Shaolin Showdowns, Mulan. No, not you. Get out of here. Teen Titans, Hi Puffy Yumi. I mean, that doesn't even mention things like anime like Naruto, One Piece, Dragon Ball Z, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Zash Bell. I could go on for days with that. But one of the things that I remember standing out most was a little show that came out in 2005 called American Dragon Jake Long. You see, I was doing my cardio at the gym one day and I just finished the last episode of the season and on whatever show it was. And I was watching and I realized I still had about 25 minutes. You know, a bit deflated. I saw a small clip from the show and was like, oh yeah, I remember the show being so good, and decided to rewatch the first season. And it was exactly as good as I remembered. And then I remembered I hadn't done an official Lousy review with Raff yet, so, you know, two birds in a single stone. So, you know, pull up a seat, set however long this video is going to be aside, and I shall take you on one Lousy review. Before we start, yes, this is going to include spoilers, but the season is literally almost 20 years old by this point. Oh. Anyway, American Dragon was created by Jeff Goad and premiered on Disney Channel on January 21st, 2005. The story follows our young protagonist, Jake Long, which, fun fact, his full name is actually Jacob Luke Long, as he fights to protect the magical creatures in New York City. Jake comes from a long line of shapeshifters that can transform their bodies into mythical dragons, and thus he has the responsibility on keeping the magical world safe and secret. The show is centered around him finding balance between his everyday normal life and being the magical protector of the NYC. The pilot for the show is known as Old School Training, and it's actually a very good pilot. We learn a lot about Jake, his situation, along with several of the key characters, and setting up the show's key points of conflict. The pilot shows us that Jake is an Asian American, cool, laid-back skater kid who likes using rapper slang, while also doing his best to take his responsibilities in stride. And personally, I thought Jake was one of the coolest characters growing up as a kid. We learn of his shape-shifting powers and all he gains from it. We learn that he has superior senses like sight and hearing. He also has super strength and durability, and is able to manipulate his tail and tongue, as well as having the legendary aspects of Drac, the ability to flight and to breathe fire. We see that Jake is first taking on the Huntsman. He's the leader of a group of hunters that hunt down mythical creatures, along with his new apprentice, Hunt Squirrel. After being saved by his grandfather, we learn that Jake still has a lot to learn, and he tries to take his grandfather's lessons to heart. After this, we meet up with Jake at his school, and we are introduced to Mr. Hans Rotwood. Professor Rotwood. Professor Rotwood is Jake's mythology teacher. Wait, what? I'd love to have a class like this as a kid. I mean, going over different mythologies like Greek, Mayan, Nordic. It's not exactly like that in the show, but it would be a cool idea. Rotwood has absolutely no knowledge on the mythical world, but is obsessed with finding proof of his existence. He has a very similar role as Mr. Crocker from Very Odd Parents. After school, Jake briefly talks to his two best friends, Trixie Carter, a witty, blunt, and sharp-tongued girl, as well as Arthur P. Spudinsky. He's a somewhat slow, but very extremely loyal, and has all Shakespearean committed to memory, and is hinted to at least be part wizard in one episode. After chatting, he begins to head out before bumping into a girl. Helping to pick up her books, he comes face to face with Rose. And to me, this is the beginning of the best romance story that has ever happened in young adult media. You can ask my buddy John, who's been on the channel a few times. One of the first things I look for when researching new games or stories in romance is options and their story. In fact, here's a clip. John, blubber! Tell me the first thing that comes to your mind when I come across a new series.
The first thing you think is, how many characters can I bang?
Thank you very much. Gotta go. Okay, bye.
Wait, what?
Basically, we learn that Jake is immediately smitten by Rose and that she has a birthmark of the shape of a dragon on her hand. Heading back, we get a bit more from Jake's grandfather and the animal guardian that assists him. Long Lousy is Jake's grandfather and dragon master. Before moving to America, he was known as the Chinese dragon and fulfilled the same role that Jake has now. His name is actually a fun play on words. Lao is Chinese for dragon, and Laoshi is Chinese for teacher. So when you put them together, you get Laoshi, or dragon teacher. He fills Jake with old Chinese proverbs and teachings. He's a very serious character, but will engage in a bit of harmless mischief in order to teach his grandchildren some lessons. He has a faithful animal guardian named Fu Dog. Now, Fu is a 600-year-old Shar-Pei and is known for making bets and mixing magical potions. And unlike Lao Shi, Fu likes to stay up to date with the current trends and culture, and is often more insightful to Jake's problem. Together, they put Jake through a training montage that seems worthless until the end of the episode. It's hard not to see that this episode was inspired heavily by The Karate Kid, and it works very well. A bit later, we also meet Jake's family. His sisters, Haley K. Long, who's intelligent, talented, overachieving, but she's also the annoying sister archetype, but also has dragon powers. Jake's mother is Susan Long, Lao Long. Unfortunately, she doesn't have any draconic powers like her children or her father since it skipped her generation, but she tries her best to make her husband doesn't find out about anything revolving around the magical world until she believes he can handle it. And then finally, there's Jonathan Long. Being the only one without knowledge of magical creatures in the family, he tries his best to be there for his family, but his son finds him to be super embarrassing. One day after school, Jake is fed up with the seemingly pointless training and decides to play hooky. However, the huntsman uses this moment to capture Jake's grandfather. Jake tracks them down, and using his training, he saves his grandfather, and the huntsman and huntsgirls retreat, but not before we get to see a brief shot of the huntsgirl having the same draconic birthmark we saw Rose have. And I'm actually really glad they didn't try to hide this from us. From the get-go, we know that the girl that Jake is crushing on is plotting to become a full member of the Hunts clan by slaying her first dragon. I really enjoy the conflict that this gives to their relationship. It gives Jake and Rose this very kind of tragic view to their dynamic. Now, Jake wants to be with a girl that wants to slay him. Overall, I think the pilot is one of the best 3 episodes of the season. It gives us so much building blocks in one 22-minute segment. I believe it's a near-perfect pilot. However, it is followed up by American Dragon's biggest flaw, the pacing. Chapter 2, pacing. Just about everything I see in season 1, I enjoyed and re-enjoyed when I watched it again. However, there is one major problem that I noticed this time around, the pacing. In simplest terms, the pacing, or pace of the narrative, is the speed in which a story is told. Now, the speed is determined by the length of the scenes, how fast the action moves, and how quickly the reader or watcher is provided with information. However, not all pacing is equal. Some genres do better with a slower pacing to really drive suspense or drama, while others benefit from a much faster pace, much more like comedies or action-adventure stories. Typically, writing the pacing is one of the key points in creating a successful story, or it can be used to destroy the potential of a great underlying narrative. For instance, let's say if in Star Wars A New Hope, if Luke were to get off of his home planet, meet up with Han and Chewie and save Princess Leia, and also successfully blow up the Death Star all in one motion, the story would be drastically different. If no other changes were happening to the movie's plot, then the movie would effectively only be half as long as it was in the original, and we would lose access to plenty of the great moments that solidified Star Wars in being arguably the greatest franchise of all time. However, on the flip side, if you were to slow the movie down too much, you leave your audience bored and uninterested. There's not really an exact science to this, and the best way to learn how to do it optimally is by trial and error. I mean, even I'm using this video as a data point to hopefully improve the pacing of my videos, so, please comment down below if you like the pacing or if you think something might be a little bit more optimal. Writing the pacing for a movie is hard enough on its own, but writers for a TV series have double duty. Not only do they need to do individual episodes, you also have to keep in mind the pacing of the season as a whole, especially if you expect your audience to keep up with an overarching story. It's the latter half here where I kind of feel the overall pacing falls off a bit. On a program like Disney XD, you can kind of hide it, seeing how there's reruns that are thrown at you left and right, but if you watch the season in order like I did, then it tends to show its strongest problems. Now, normally you would expect episode 2 to follow after episode 1, and episode 3 to follow after 2, and so on and so forth until the end of the season. Makes sense. Humans are kind of keen to organization like that when it comes to media or entertainment. However, there are several moments in American Dragon Season 1 where we see events out of order. For example, episode 11 has Jake learn that Foo Dog can make him a potion that allows him to use his shape-shifting powers to transform into any one or any other magical creature he thinks of. And in exchange for this, he cannot use his draconic form or powers until the potion wears off in roughly about 24 hours. It's a fun little side episode that I enjoyed and has plenty of comedic moments. However, in the timeline of American Dragon, this happens before the events of episode 9, which I'll go into deeper a bit later. Of course, young kids aren't really going to notice things like this, however, it's still an objective flaw in the season's flow. Now, the chronological order for the show is as follows. And the biggest thing that kind of pisses me off about this is that episode 14 is after episode 21. The season finale. The focal cliffhanger of the season that holds the most emotional weight for our protagonist, and he doesn't even acknowledge it in episode 14, but it's fine. It's not like I was invested. The biggest point of contention for this is episode 12. I'll go over the episode more a bit later, but it's the second most pivotal episode for Jake and Rose's relationship, and yet after this, we don't even see them interact again for, wait for it, 9 more episodes. Until the finale, Rose isn't even in another episode outside the Halloween special, and in that, she gets conveniently knocked out while Jake is there in human form. Now, my theory was that episode 12 was originally supposed to be episode 20, but someone thought the season needed a strong midpoint episode, so they were forced to move it to episode 12. In the order they give, Jake never even thinks about what he learns at the end of episode 12 until the finale, and it just feels jarring when you watch them in order. Anyway, enough ranting. Now, I might just be looking too much into it, but it does feel really strange. I usually like to watch things in chronological order, but for season 1, I listed the episodes in what I think would be the most enjoyable in order. So, if you have a small inclination to rewatch season 1 for yourself to see if it's as good or as bad as you remember, give my list a try and tell me if you enjoyed it. Chapter 3 Extras. There was other series I enjoyed from Disney around this time, like rewatching the reruns of Lilo and Stitch the series. There's Kim Possible, Dave the Barbarian, Phil of the Future, Brandy and Mr. Whiskers, or even watching the Halloween Town movies every year, each with their own strong suits and fun gimmicks. But I think this was right around the time I started drawing and getting obsessed with the idea of having this kind of human dragon hybrid for a protagonist. It's one of the reasons I was drawn to Natsu from Fairy Tail, but American Dragon had to be the kind of tipping point in which I started getting into these stories and fun characters, and I'm actually really thankful for that. I shudder to think who I'd be if I never got into it. I just wanted to take some of the time to really talk about some of the episodes I really enjoyed, starting with Episode 4, The Legend of the Dragon's Tooth. I really enjoyed this episode. It was written by Kathleen Lewin. Sorry if I'm butchering names here. And it came out on February 4th, 2005. Now, the premise is that Jake and his friends have plans to attend the 3rd annual Hip Hop Video Music Award. However, Jake is stuck at home babysitting his little sister, Haley, that night. Helping his friends, Trixie and Spud agree to take shifts babysitting with Jake so that they can all enjoy their awards together. I really enjoy this because a lot of media has these kind of supposed friend groups, but everyone ends up acting more like villains to each other than actual friends. I'm looking at you, proud family. It really shows the connection the three share, and it helps make future actions more believable. I also love, Haley and Jake's dynamic as well. Jake is the very relatable situation where he feels he's stuck to his little sister while constantly feeling like she's rubbing her achievements in his face, but actually Haley just wants to get closer to her big brother and tries her best to be better than her brother in hopes that Jake will see her as an equal, which is something a lot of younger siblings can relate to as well. Meanwhile, we find out that the Tooth Fairy, voiced by Ida McClurg, I think that's how you say it, is going about her job when she realizes that Haley is about to lose one of her baby dragon teeth. It's at this moment that her assistant, Dr. Diente, betrays her and steals her wand in order to steal the dragon's tooth. Now, the fun fact is that Dr. Diente is voiced by John C. McGinley. Yeah, that's right. Harry Cox from Scrubs is our villain. This guy. And the reason I love this episode so much is for this line delivery when the Tooth Fairy is telling him he'll never get away with it.
You leave her alone! That little girl's as precious as a butterfly perched on a freshly bloomed...
I don't know why, but this has probably stuck with me since I was a kid for so long, and to be honest, it's probably the reason my humor is so out there today. I don't know why. The moment alone will pop into my head at random times, and I'll just start laughing. Now, the episode ends with Jake saving Haley and showing that despite how he acts, Jake really loves his sister and takes her back home. Episode 10, Bodyguard Duty. Now, written by Laura McCreary and aired April 29th, 2005, this is a neat little side story that involves Jake needing to guard a pair of twin girls. However, these girls are oracles and have the ability to see the future. Now, Kara is the super energetic and happy oracle that can only see the bad things that happen to people and places, while Sarah is the more goth-like aggressive oracle that can only see the good things that happen to people and places. Both are voiced by Tara Strong, and if you know anything about voice acting work, you'll know she voices a lot of characters, 5 of which are in this very show alone. The episode has Jake abusing their powers and trying to find out the answers to his mythology test for Professor Rotwood, while also trying to impress Rose. I really enjoy the idea of twin oracles in which only one can see positive outcomes while the other can only see negative. It's very creative. The ending also has Kara tell Jake that Rose has a deep dark secret. However, since Jake is an idiot in episode 12, this never even mattered. Moving right along to episode 9, Dragon Summit. Now, this is written by Brandon Sawyer, and it was aired April 1st, 2005. I read somewhere that this was the staff's favorite episode of the season, and it's kind of tough for me to disagree. It's certainly top 3 for the season. The episode opened up a lot of world building for the show, and it was actually a really great addition. The episode starts with Jake taking an elevator to attend the World Dragon Summit, a gathering of the world's dragons. It's here we see that the 3 dragons holding the highest rank are called the Dragon Council. Upon hearing some of Jake's adventures, the council members believe that Jake has been too immature as the American dragon and instruct him to take a test with 3 challenges. If he fails, he would lose his grandfather as his dragon master and be issued a new one. Jake also comes into contact with Fred Nerd, the Australian dragon, and the two form a bit of a rivalry. It's this episode that we learn that the magical world has a list of 13 biggest threats to the magical world itself. The huntsman and his clan are listed as number 4, and Naturally, Jake wants to know about the top threat, and it's here that we learn that there is a dark dragon that went rogue a long time ago. They're also unaware that the very dragon is camped underground the very island with plans on meeting the American dragon. The dark dragon is kind of the secondary antagonist to the show and is voiced by Clancy Brown, who's probably most known for Mr. Krabs. I love the design to the dark dragon being a bigger, evil version of Jake's design as a symbol of what Jake could become. After the meeting, Jake manages to get away, and the only other episode he's in for season 1 ends up making him look very weak to what he was hyped up to be, but in short, he wants to enslave humanity and form a draconic oligarch. He's last seen in the season being crushed by a pallet of bricks, but escaping, vowing revenge. So finally we get to what I really want to talk about. The main driving factor for me in this show was the relationship between Jake and Rose. If I had to sum up the relationship between the two, it would be something I call combative fatalism. Now, fatalism is the belief that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. Kind of think Neji in the original Naruto series. Jake is the magical protector of the magical world and the American dragon. Meanwhile, Rose was inducted into a clan of ninjas whose sole purpose is to capture and slay magical creatures, dragons being their top priority. Their situations drive a huge wedge in Jake's personal goals of being with Rose, and it's great conflict. However, the first season is the building blocks and the setup. Despite both living double lives, the two are interested in each other and they do want to be together. The most obvious reference to this is what I believe inspired the dynamic, and of course that's Romeo and Juliet. Two individuals whose love for each other is hindered by their personal circumstances, and there's even a brief blink and you miss it reference to Romeo and Juliet that I want to highlight a bit later. One of the worst things you can do for your story when writing a romantic subplot is either A, have it form out of nowhere and at the very end of the story with no build-up, but I mean, who on earth would ever do that? Or you go with B. You pull your audience along the entire story with a will they won't they aspect just for it to go absolutely nowhere, with the exception of a vague alluding to it. But I mean, it's like we've never seen that. One of the best things about getting invested into a relationship story is to actually see them in a relationship. I feel like many writers believe that once you establish a relationship, that's it. And if the reader or the audience gets closure on the relationship, they'll no longer be invested, and thus they need to kind of push the will they won't they aspect of the relationship as long as they can. Spider-Man is notorious for doing this. They can never just let Peter be happy, because without conflict, eventually you run out of ideas. So what happens when you finally have Peter marry the love of his life and live happily ever after with Mary Jane? Why, you make it so Peter and MJ have to sell their marriage to the demon Mephisto so he can save his aunt's life. Like, what? Thankfully, American Dragon doesn't do this, but instead has the conflict of Jake and Rose's relationship stem from their circumstances. From episode 1, we know that Jake likes Rose, Jake is the American Dragon, and Rose is part of the Hunts clan. Their interactions as their alter egos also gives them a bit of unique chemistry that carries over to their, quote, normal lives as well. Again, the worst part of season 1 is that it feels like episode 12 was put out of nowhere before it was supposed to be. The first half of the season has moments of Jake actively trying to develop his relationship with Rose, while the second half only has 1 or 2 mentions of her, and it all stems from that episode. In the next bit of development we get comes from episode 2, Dragon's Breath. Now, episode 2 starts with Jake fighting a creature in the sewer and mentioning his school fall dance, but the creature escapes him from now. Jake and his friends talk about the dance the next morning, and we learn that Trixie and Spud are going together, while Jake is eager to ask Rose. This is continuing his interest in her from the pilot. After getting a face full of locker, he learns that another boy asked her first. Brad is a small reoccurring antagonist for Jake, and he's a 15-year-old school bully and all-around jerk. Feeling embarrassed, Jake lies about already having a date with the hottest girl. We see him getting rejected by a few girls because he has a case of severe bad breath, and no matter how hard he tries, he can't seem to get rid of it. After school, Jake learns that his fire glands are mutating, while Foo Dog helps him make a trinket to suppress his breath and takes him to a place known as Magus Bazaar, a kind of marketplace for all things magical. It's here that he meets a girl called Jasmine, a very pretty girl in town visiting her family, and within 30 seconds, Jake gets a date for his school dance. I mean, I will never have the riz of this guy. However, we also see that she has something going on with her as well. Jake brings Jasmine to his school, and almost immediately every guy is drooling for her. We cut back to Lousy, and he finds out that Jasmine is something called a Nyx, a soul-sucking monster, and when the moon reaches the center of the sky, it's said to transform into its true form. It's much more than likely that Jasmine was supposed to be a take on a succubus, but you could see why that wouldn't really go over well in a kids show. Jake meets up with Brad and Rose, and Brad immediately wants to ditch Rose as his date for Jasmine. As Jake enjoys the dance, he sees that Rose is sitting by herself, and he goes to talk to her. She tells him that Brad asked her out only so he could dance with the prettiest girl in the room, and while we see him dancing with Jasmine, Jake tells her that he wants to dance with the prettiest girl and leads her to the dance floor. Again, smooth as hell. This kid's only 13, by the way. I don't have this riz as a grown adult. It's only a few seconds, but it's a very cute moment that's the starting point of Rose's attraction to Jake. As the two dance, we see that Jasmine is beginning to suck the souls out of the kids at the dance. Now, Jake ends up defeating Jasmine, but loses his trinket, and as he goes to leave the dance, Rose stops him and telling him that they both came with the wrong people, and hopefully they end up making better choices. The episode ends with Jake walking Jasmine back home. Dragon Breath was written by Laura McCreary. The next episode that expanded on their relationship is Episode 5, Act 4, Scene 15. Written by Matthew Newbury, this episode is much like Episode 2. The episode is based around Jake and Rose while also having to deal with their respective double lives. The episode starts with the dragons fighting the huntsman and huntsgirl over a magical scarab that can be used to bring the dead back to life. With the scarab bouncing in between Jake and Rose throughout the episode, Jake learns that Rose is going to be a leading lady in the school's play for Anthony and Cleopatra. It's a tragic tale of two that love each other being separated and tragically losing their lives by their own hands. When Jake learns that the role for Anthony is open, he plans to audition for it. We also learn that the huntsman wants to use the scarab to revive the past generation of Hunts clan members. Jake ends up getting the part, while Trixie tells him instead of just going through all these hurdles, he should just ask Rose straight out. After bringing Rose to his grandfather's shop to rehearse, Rose wants to go over the play's most intimate scene, Act 4, Scene 15. Now, in the play, it's after Anthony had been fooled into thinking that Cleopatra was killed, and thus he attempts to end his own life to be with her. Only after mortally wounding himself does he realize that Cleopatra is alive and well. His men quickly bring him to her, and the two share a passionate kiss. Jake tries to kind of psych himself up, but he's never actually kissed a girl before, and gets cold feet. In doing so, he ends up losing the scarab that was in his custody. The next day at school, Jake and Rose talk about what happened. Rose thinks she's freaked Jake out and tries to apologize, but Jake tries to bluff his way through. Rose reluctantly agrees to have the two rehearse at her home. Right before they can go through with the kiss, however, they both hear a large knock at the door. Freaking them out that the huntsman is home, Rose quickly throws Jake under the table. As the huntsman enters, the scarab makes its way from Jake's backpack into Rose's, and while Jake tries to retrieve it, Rose manages to get him out of there unseen. The next morning, Rose makes her way back to Lousy's shop in order to apologize to Jake for what happened and ask if they can rehearse at Jake's place. Being embarrassed of his family, Jake has an idea to rehearse at Trixie's place. Rose tells Jake that she thinks they're having trouble with Act 4, Scene 15 because they haven't earned it, saying that Anthony and Cleopatra had been through so much together and they haven't been through anything. Before rehearsing, they notice that the scarab has snuck its way out of Rose's backpack, and the two head out to capture it. They end up meeting on the rooftop and fight over the bug. Before Jake can retrieve it, the huntsman comes along and steals it, getting away with Rose. On the night of the play, Jake learns that Rose can't make it due to a, quote, family thing, but she thinks that if she hurries, she can make it back in time for the kiss. Jake learns from Spud the location of where the huntsman is working out of and flies off, telling Spud to keep the play going for as long as he can before Act 4, Scene 15. Jake, Lousy, and Foo Dog make their way to begin fighting the huntsman and Rose before the scarab hits the moonlight and begins resurrecting past huntsmen. Fortunately, Jake is able to grab the spell book before the spell is finished, and the huntsman returns to the afterlife. During the fight, Rose gets injured in her leg, and the two escape. As Jake returns to the play, he finds out that Rose never made it back. The next day, he sees her in school with a cast on, claiming that she fell at her event. We see Jake is a bit suspicious about this before seeming to let it go, and it goes nowhere. I mean, it's another context clue that just flies right over his head, but hey, just keep that in mind. He offers to do another play with Rose for Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, I did bring it back, I told you. But thanks to Trixie, he just asks her straight out on her normal date, and Rose accepts. All in all, this episode was everything I liked about the show. It had great pacing, good drama, action, and the main thing being about Jake and Rose. Outside of a few small moments, we don't get much of Rose again until episode 12, The Ski Trip. Now, the ski trip is where a lot of the pacing issues come from, if you ask me. Episode 12 is the halfway mark for the season, and until now, we've had a good bit of Jake and Rose's development. However, after this episode, till the finale, Rose only shows up in one episode, and she and Jake don't even interact as both of themselves or as their alter egos. She gets conveniently knocked out at the start of the battle. It's strange because someone went out of their way to make sure that what happens after episode 12 doesn't get resolved till the finale, but there's 9 episodes where we get nothing. Anyway, I like to believe that episode 5 and 12 happen relatively close together, and 12 and 21 happen almost right after each other. The flow seems better in my opinion. At the start of the ski trip, we see that Jake and Rose are actually on a real date out in what might be Manhattan Park. Being winter, the two are building snowmen. When Rose goes to collect sticks for arms, Jake uses his fire to quickly turn the snowman into an ice sculpture of Rose. Now, how did he do this? I don't know, or how he got all the fine details out of one burst of his fire, but it's a cartoon, so I'm gonna let it go. Rose sees the sculpture and is amazed by it, but before Jake can kiss her, they hear her pager going off. What 13-year-old kid has a pager? This isn't the 80s. Even back in 2004, kids were running around with flip phones. How does Rose have a pager? After Jake meets back up with his friends, he tells them of his date, and they all board the bus to head to the weekend-long school ski trip. The three talk about Jake and Rose, and Jake believes that if he ever wants anything to happen between the two of them, he has to tell her that he's a dragon. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, it's a good thing. If you are a magical creature, you would want to tell or inform your significant other this before getting into a long-term committed relationship, and he's already doing a much better job than what his mom is doing. She hasn't even told her husband her secret for presumably 15 years. However, Jake and Rose have only gone on one official date so far. Jake is under the impression that Rose is just a normal girl, and he wants to tell her A, that magical creatures exist, and B, not only is he one, but he's also in charge of protecting the magical world, all after one date. Correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but if after one date, the guy you saw told you that, let's say a werewolf, wouldn't you be like, oh, he's crazy? And even if he could prove it by turning into an actual werewolf, wouldn't that just freak you out more? We know that Rose already knows magical creatures and the world itself. It's just crazy to me that Jake thought this was such a good idea. This could backfire so easily. On the bus, we find out it's Valentine's Day, and Rose gets forced into sitting next to Brad. Yay, he's back. Rose is justifiably still a bit ticked off at him for ditching her at the dance, but he claims to have changed, yet we can clearly say that that's not the case. Upon getting to the lodge, we see that Trixie is Rose's roommate for the weekend, and while Jake gets roomed with Brad. Spud also ends up getting into a one-sided pillow fight. He also wants to conquer his fear of the ski lift this weekend, having never been able to ride it in his entire life so far. That's a thing. Now, Rose meets up with Jake and his friends, and we get reintroduced to her birthmark. It's coming back at the end of the episode, so basically this is the setup for it. Before Jake gets a chance to talk to her, Brad comes along and practically kidnaps her. It's one of the only things I don't really like about this episode. Jake wants to talk to Rose, she wants to hang out with him, and yet whenever they get together, Brad usually ends up causing the two to separate, and not once does Rose tell him to hit the bricks. I mean, I know why it has to happen, but it just feels like it could have been written better. After helping Spud with the lift a few times, Jake hears the cry of an abominable snowman. Checking it out, he finds out the Hunts girl is there, and the two have a small fight before Rose gets away. Jake notices that she dropped a ski pass that was only issued to those out for his school. This is another thing that bothers me. Jake now has enough context clues to figure out that Rose is the Hunts girl. He sees that both of them have blonde hair, there's what happened at the play, the vision that Kara gave him in episode 10, and now he knows it's one of the kids on the field trip. He's got significant evidence for him to realize it, and yet he denies it. I understand that denial is a powerful thing and he's a 13-year-old kid, but he's shown to be so much smarter than he is in the episode. Once again, Jake tries to talk to Rose, and again, Brad steps in. It's just a bit aggravating knowing that the only reason that this is happening is so that Jake can't really talk to Rose. Instead of all this, we could have actually had some good development for Rose. Instead of all this Brad nonsense, I'd much prefer to see a scene with Trixie and Rose talking in their room, like see how well they click and get some actual answers on Rose. So far, we know that she has some kind of attraction to Jake. If we had her honest feelings on this episode along with Jake's, then the heartbreak the show wants us to feel at the end of the episode would have been a lot greater. Instead of all that, we get Jake being an idiot trying to capture the Hunts girl around the lodge in his human form. So there's just so much runtime dedicated to this. Basically, Jake runs around wasting time on trying to figure out like where the Hunts girl is while nothing actually happens, till Rose ends up heading out and trying to lure the American Dragon out. Meanwhile, unlike Jake, Trixie is able to piece together that Rose is the Hunts girl with less information than Jake has, mind you. And at one point, Jake unironically claims that Trixie might be the Hunts girl. What? How in the blue hell are you being so dumb right now? You've known her almost your entire life. She didn't even know magical creatures existed until you told her. Not to mention, you fought the Hunts girl countless times, and you can see through her mask that she's white and Trixie is black. And Trixie doesn't have blonde hair. It's not like the Huntsgirl is hiding it. It's a huge braid. This really bothers me when characters act really out of character because the writers thought it needed to happen. I haven't felt this way since my man's Vegeta was shell-shocked in the original DBZ Broly. Like, if you don't get your bum ass up and do something.
What do you think you're doing? Why don't you stop whining like a baby and fight like a man? Why? What for? Broly's unbeatable.
I'm not going to claim to be a fantastic writer or anything, but I would have had Jake struggle with the idea of telling Rose because, again, he thinks she's just a normal girl, and actually have the two hang out on the trip, both have a great time. Meanwhile, we get two important scenes, one where Jake talks about Rose and one where Rose talks about Jake. For Jake, I'd say have him talk to his friends in the lounge or somewhere, Rose can accidentally hear. We can have Jake say some of the things he likes about her, like how she's kind and pretty, maybe a particular thing only he's noticed, maybe how her nose scrunches up when she's concentrating, something personal, something that shows how much Jake cares about her. And for Rose, we can have the idea I mentioned earlier. Rose and Trixie are in their room talking about the topic, when Rose and Trixie are in their rooms talking when the topic of Jake comes up. Now, I've never been a teenage girl, so I'm going to spare you the dialogue, but the idea is to essentially show that Rose does have some feelings for Jake. After we see that the huntsman contacts her to catch the abominable snowman, and her and Jake have the same moment exchanging blows, she runs off, drops her card, only this time Jake is conflicted by the evidence, and instead of claiming his best friend is secretly a ninja trying to slay him, he's trying to justify any and all reason why Rose isn't the Huntsgirl. But he starts remembering all the other clues about her, and while he denies it, all of it weighs on his mind to this point. I think it would really highlight the drama. However, I feel like a certain amount of action was required, and thus they had to make Jake do this. Anyway, Jake runs after Rose, and we get this nice little visual of Jake using his Eye of the Dragon to see Rose standing on a mountainside before some snow blows in Jake's face. And when he wipes it off and sees it again, it's actually the Huntsgirl standing in her place. It's just a nice little visual thing I like. Jake flies off to fight the Huntsgirl before immediately getting captured. Jake, I swear, you need to start fixing yourself right now. You are not this cool guy right now. On a better note, Trixie and Spud agree to help find Jake, and we get another great line of delivery of Professor Rotwood go down.
Where exactly do you think you're going?
I don't know why I enjoy this so much. It's just so good. Jake ends up freezing himself, and the Huntsgirl ends up turning her weapon into a snowboard. Don't ask me why. It turns into a snowboard. I don't know. Don't ask me why. It just does. And Jake ends up chasing her for a bit before throwing icicles at her, trapping her into a tree. Damn, Jake, you almost turned her into that one dude in Die Hard 2, which I can't show because YouTube is not a big fan of that sort of stuff. Rose taunts him to finish the job and that there will be more huntsmen, but Jake wants to look at her right hand. He takes off her glove and sees the same birthmark that she showed him earlier. It's here that Jake gets undeniable proof that this is actually Rose, and Jake is heartbroken, even more so when Rose ends up freeing herself and pretty much brags about the fact that it's a symbol of the Hunts clan, a mark that ensures her that she was born to do one thing, slaying dragons, right to his face. Rose goes for the finishing blow, but accidentally causes an avalanche. Good job. Jake is able to dodge it, but he notices that Rose is being dragged off a cliff and dashes in to save her. Saving her life, he goes to walk away, but Rose ends up trying to still slay him. Like, damn, Rose, that's cold. But before she can succeed, Spud and Trixie jump off the ski lift. What? Those things on average are 30 feet or higher. There's no way you're jumping off that thing without jumping into your own grave. Just saying. At the very least, serious bodily harm. But hey, you conquered your fear, Spud. Whatever. They stop Rose, but she ends up getting away again while Jake is keen to letting her go. Jake's sitting on the bus depressed when he gets approached by Rose, and when she asks to sit with him, we get this brief little montage of the moments they've had together. And even as a kid, I remember this hitting me pretty hard. As he tells her it is, she walks off clearly hurt, but without a word. It does a good job. However, I feel like if the episode had a bit more focus on the two and their relationship, the ending would have hit a lot harder. And this is the moment where the second of the series pretty much has to forget about Rose. The showrunners want to deal with the aftermath, but they know it's the strongest part of the season, so they need to save it for the finale. So we don't get anything for like 9 episodes. In all of those episodes, they don't talk to each other. There's one small odd reference in episode 19, but outside that, he never even thinks about her or talks about what happened until the season's finale. I don't know. I have so many conflicting things about this. I do like this episode, but since I like it so much, I'm so much more inclined to criticize it. This had the makings of being the best episode of the season, even better than the finale, in my opinion. But I think they dropped the ball, or basically that ball was chained to their leg and they had to drag it wherever they went. I don't know. One of the two. Anyway, we're moving on to the season finale. Episode 21, The Hunt. The beginning to episode 21 has Jake at his locker when Rose wants to talk to him, and he flashes back to what happened on episode 12 when he sees her birthmark. After the second half of the season, we finally get some development addressing this, and it's why I put episodes 5, 12, and 21 right in the general facility. They all seem to flow together in terms of Jake and Rose's relationship, at least the most pivotal point. Jake quickly bails, and we see him talking to his friends about Rose after school. Trixie is the one telling Jake to forget about her, because she'd slay him in a minute if she knew the truth. However, the scene cuts to Rose heading to her room and gazing longingly into a picture that she has of her and Jake at the dance back in episode 2. We finally get some hard evidence as to her feelings on Jake before she quickly is summoned by her huntsmaster. We get a brief mention of a special hunt where the prize is the hide of the American dragon. Jake gets a brief lesson on leadership training before getting ambushed by Rose on his way back home. Jake chases her into a trap and gets knocked out. Waking up in one of the Hunt's clan's carts, he's chained to other magical creatures. We have Reggie the Brownie, Silver the Mermaid, a giant named Bertha, and finally a leprechaun named Clooney. They're all chained up onto wooden beams as the Hunt's clan intends to release them at dawn for a 10-minute head start before hunting them down and bagging them as trophies. Rose wants to get one last look at Jake before the morning, and she can't help but notice that there's something familiar. You don't say! It's not like he's got the same hair and personality as the boys you keep on your nightstand or anything, but you know. Jake tries his best to get through to her and ends up even alluding to her name, all the while trying to pickpocket the key on her belt. Rose is still reserved to fulfill her destiny as she leaves. The key gets them free from the post, but they're still chained together. As dawn breaks, the Hunt clan unleashes their hounds and begins tracking them down. Hiding in a tree, the group is spotted before they head into a body of water, where we find out that Silver, a mermaid, is afraid of water. They land in an area filled with geysers, filled with flammable gas. The Huntsman chases them down while Jake takes his teachings from his grandfathers on leaderships and puts them into practice. Once they use the Hunt's clan's weapons to break their chains, Jake uses his fire to force the Hunt's clan to fall back. Once safe, Jake tells the other creatures that they need to stay together and fight back, hitting their camp at sunset and helps the group train in the meantime. The Hunt's clan patrol the area. Jake decides to lure them away, but ends up getting recaptured. Good job. Bringing him back to their camp, Rose is still set to strike him down, but hesitates for a second before the group of magical creatures attacks the Hunt's clan. Everyone ends up using their shortcomings as an advantage, and Silver ends up even swimming. Better late than never, I guess. With Jake freed, he helps chase off the Hunt's clan, but ends up getting pinned to a tree while Rose closes in on him ready to strike. It's at this moment Jake finally reveals himself by first calling her name, and in her confusion, he finally tells her the truth and reverts to his human form in front of her. Surprised, she takes her mask off and stares at him in disbelief. However, a second later, she begins charging again. Jake closes his eyes, prepared for the inevitable. He feels his binds have been cut, and he sees that Rose freed him. He's running off. He tries to catch up with her, but is stopped by the other magical creatures. The episode ends with Jake heading back to school in hopes to catch back up with Rose, and however, she's not there. Asking the principal for more information, Jake learns that Rose transferred out of that school that same very day. Dumbfounded, Jake is given the same picture we saw earlier saying that Rose left it for him. And that's the end of the season. Big old cliffhanger ending. I remember watching this as a kid freaking out like, what? That's my kid voice, I'm sorry. I feel almost as heartbroken as Jake did, thinking to myself, I needed the next episode like right away. Although right away didn't come for like 6 months later when season 2 aired. Despite its flaws, I love the introduction to Jake and Rose's romance. It doesn't actually get going into season 2. And there is where we actually get to see them together. And everything about season 2, except for some things that I will mention later, almost everything has been expanded upon. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in season 1, you have, I think, what was it, like 4 or 5 writers doing solo episodes by themselves. But season 2 is, I think, 2 writers working in tandem. And I think everything's a lot more coherent. I can't wait to rewatch season 2 and talk about it. But we're not talking about it now. So season 1's portrayal of the two is very similar to the tragedy we see in episode 5. The idea that they fight against their respective circumstances in order to find happiness with each other. It's a nice way to introduce kids into the tragedy genre and setting up a lot of possibilities for the next season. All in all, we know by the end of season 1 how each character feels about the other and where they are now. I'm already thinking of a great moment near the beginning of season 2, but I want to save it for my next Lousy review. But there we have it. If you stuck around till now, thanks. I hope you've enjoyed it. Rewatching this series has been a huge blast of nostalgia, and I can ultimately say that it's held up quite well. I can't wait to do a video on season 2, but that might take a couple of weeks. Writing my own scripts is a bit of a chore. But hopefully between that and Raff's amazing editing, as usual, you guys found the video worthwhile. If you guys wouldn't mind, please hit that like, share, subscribe, especially if you want me to do a part 2 for season 2. It's the first official media review with Raff, and I can honestly say that people should rewatch this series. It's still a lot of fun for kids and adults. If you want to see all that, stay tuned for season 2. Until then, I will catch you in the next one. Later.